He's also one of 7 authors of a new world history book, a beautiful book that I urge everybody to run out and buy. It's called Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, put together by various members of the history department of Queen's University. He's also edited 5 other volumes on political corruption, European intellectual history, Mongolia, Russia and Asia, and regional histories. He's twice been a visiting professor in Japan. He's traveled widely in Russia and the old Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. He works as a consultant sometimes to the Soros Open Society. He writes books and book reviews and essays for the New Republic, the New York Times. And you may have heard his voice on the radio because he is a commentator for NPR and the BBC. A few years ago, Professor Kotkin won the Teaching Award as a for engaging, lively lecture. The only other thing I want to say about Professor Kotkin is he has a beautiful, beautiful 1-year-old. We'd like to welcome him.
Often that the person who introduces you could also deliver the lecture. However, it's quite often that the introduction is better than the lecture. So, for example, Chauncey Depew, you may know him as a politician from New York State, was perhaps the greatest introducer in speaker history, and once he was introducing, I believe it was Taft, and Taft is a very large sort of person, and Chauncey Depew thought he would poke a little fun at Taft. So he said, here is Taft, blah, blah, pregnant with integrity, pregnant with sagacity. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome. And Taft comes out, and he says, if it's a boy, I'll name him Sagacity. And if it's a girl, I'll name her Integrity. But if it's Gantz, as I suspect, I'll name it Chauncey Depew. And now somehow you have to give a lecture. I don't lecture this semester. I'm teaching 2 seminars this semester. So if you hear the grinding rust in my delivery, it's because I'm rusty. I used to lecture in this very room when I did a course we fondly called Plato to NATO, Part 2. Plato to NATO Part 1 goes from Plato to 1700, somehow in 12 weeks. The Plato to NATO Part 2 went from 1700 to the present. And it was, anyway, those were the old days. So, Soviet utopia. No doubt you came tonight for French utopia. That accounts for the large turnout. But I screwed up the chronology. Don't record that hard. Because I couldn't do it next week, so we're a little bit out of order. And for those who came for French utopia, I apologize. But I'll see you next. You'll have it next week. So Soviet utopia. What could possibly be entertaining or informative about Soviet utopia? I thought I'd start out with the 3rd anniversary of the October Revolution in 1920. The 3rd anniversary of the October Revolution in 1920, October 1917, is Revolution 3rd anniversary, and there was a reenactment in front of the Winter Palace, which was then still Petrograd, hadn't become Leningrad yet. It was on the way to becoming Leningrad, today St. Petersburg. In front of the Winter Palace, which of course the Winter Palace was the Baroque palace created by Catherine the Great. It's where the Hermitage is today, and it's also where the actual October Revolution took place 3 years earlier. This is a reenactment of it. And for the reenactment, they had about 6,000 to 8,000 participants and about 100,000 spectators. If you know anything about the storming of the Winter Palace, they didn't have 6,000 to 8,000 stormers, and they didn't have 100,000 spectators. They had a bunch of soldiers who broke their way into the Winter Palace, arrested the provisional government, which was cowering upstairs in one of the back rooms, and then proceeded to the wine cellar in the basement and drank or shot with their rifles the greatest wine collection in the history of humanity. Better than the French wine collection, and in fact most of it was French, the Tsarist wine collection. Some of it they did drink, but most of it they shot. It was lost. That was the primary activity of the storming of the Winter Palace, which became a myth of revolutionary action. Anyway, so here's the reenactment with far greater numbers and this huge 100,000 spectators all across. I don't know if you've been to the Hermitage, but this square is colossal outside the palace. And so the reenactment, 2 platforms, 2 stages, one white and one red. Just in case you didn't get it, one white and one red. And then a bridge in between the 2 stages. And it's dark. You can't see what's going on. And then a little bit of music comes up. And it's called the Symphony for Robespierre, of all things. That's why I should have given a lecture next week so you could have the French stuff today. But anyway, this is an educated audience, unlike the undergraduates. Well, if they were educated, would they be paying $140,000 to see lectures like this? I don't think so. Anyway, by the way, I know this is an evening lecture, but no snoring. You can fall asleep, but no snoring. Yes, this is where I'll be 10 minutes away from the part where... I've given these adult school lectures before. You think I don't know? Undergraduates can last 22 minutes plus 8 minutes for commercials. It's at the 30-minute mark that they disappear in consciousness from the lecture. Anyway, so the stages, the little Robespierre Symphony, and then a flashlight shines on the white stage. And it's Alexander Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, giving a windy speech, as he was wont to do. And then there were generals and ministers and those fat capitalist pigs with sacks of money and everything in disarray. The generals, the white guard generals, the ministers, the capitalist pigs, the white stage. And then a light shines on the other stage. And it's the workers and the peasants and the red guards, that is to say workers with rifles. And they're in complete disarray on their stage. The Kerensky stage, they start out in order and then they begin to get into disarray as time moves on. The red stage, they start out in disarray and they begin to get into order. And you begin to hear the International playing a little bit. And it gets louder and it gets louder. And the red stage gets more orderly and more orderly until they're in rows, neat rows, and their rifles are ready. And someone gives a shout, the name of Lenin, and they begin to cross the bridge from the red stage to the white stage. And they've got their rifle butts out, and they're chasing across the stage, and the white stage goes into panic. And Kerensky adorns a costume, dresses up as a woman, and flees. Sneaks out of there, gets away, and the red guards grab the capitalists, the sacks of money and everything, and then they proceed all the way from the white stage to the Winter Palace itself, which they storm. And the Aurora, a little battleship in the Neva River next to the Winter Palace, fires a single shot, and that's it. The October Revolution, and the crowd is jubilant. Well, what's wrong with this picture, as they say? Well, in October 1917, there were no reds and whites yet. The Russian Civil War hadn't happened yet. The Russian Civil War began in 1918. But the reenactment has looked back and cast this event in terms of subsequent events. The 1918, 1919, 1920 Civil War between reds and whites. Moreover, not only is the reenactment casting it in terms that it couldn't have originally happened in. Kerensky, by the way, doesn't dress. He does flee the country and ends up in America for about 40 years a big pain in the neck was here. Anyhow, another thing is, as I suggested, that the reenactment is more heroic and more participatory than the actual revolution itself. But in fact, that's the story I'm going to tell. The story I'm going to tell is the heroic mythologies and the living of the revolution after October 1917. So not October 1917, but October 1917 after October 1917. That's the little story I want to tell in the remaining time that I have. So the notion that there's something that happens which encompasses the masses, some large-scale changes, some, you might call it utopia, some large process, some huge changes, some great possibilities, and the reenactments get bigger and bigger and bigger until the whole country is living utopia, living the revolution. But the nature of the revolution changes over time. Just as the 1920 reenactment has the 1918 to 20 Civil War projected back onto 1917, so the events of the 1930s and 40s and 50s will be the way that the reenactments and the understanding and the living of the revolution will change. So, so much for the open. Where are we going to go with this? So H.G. Wells, you must know H.G. Wells. He visited the Kremlin, I believe it was 1922. Had a little talk with Lenin, might have been 1920, 21. I'm not as good with dates since I got into this historical profession. And he has him sit down with Lenin. He comes out of the Kremlin and he says, this guy is a dreamer in the Kremlin. It's a much quoted characterization of Lenin. He's a dreamer in the Kremlin. And in fact, it's not only inside the Kremlin, but people are living in communes. Peasants are celebrating festivals for the tractor. Statues not only of Marx and Engels, but Darwin, for example, and Alexander Herzen and Chernyshevsky and other Russian heroes, are being erected in place of the statues for the old czars or for the old generals. And so there's a way in which it's not just the reenactment on the stage, but it's beginning to spread throughout society. There are holidays in the village, as I said, like celebration of the tractor. There's May Day, or May 1st, International Workers' Day sometimes called. There's this October Revolution celebration, which of course is November 7th, because the calendar's changed, it's 13 days different. So the October 25th Revolution is celebrated on November 7th. Try to explain that to the undergraduate population that the October Revolution happened in November. Anyway, so there's these new holidays, new festivals, new statues, these communes, or people living as some people in the audience might have lived 40 years ago in communities that were trying to be different from the established norm. New names. For example, Vlad Len is a very popular first name from the time period. Vladimir Lenin. And the kid is named Vlad Len. That's the first name. And then when they get to be 67 years of age and the revolution doesn't quite look as good as it was when they were first born, someone says to them, well, what does your name mean? It's kind of an unusual name. They say, well, it means Vladimir Lenin. Oktobrina is one of the most popular female names for October Revolution, Oktobrina. So there's all sorts of ways in which the revolution addressed between people. Instead of Mr. and Ms., there's comrade or tovarishch. There's all sorts of ways in which the revolution can be lived on a day-to-day basis, even if you're not on the stage or seeing the Winter Palace reenactment. This period of the 1920s, this period of the post-1917, the 1920s revolutionary period, is very popular among people who treat utopia as a kind of hippieization process. Freedom, anarchy, possibilities, right? Anti-establishment. It's extremely popular. It makes utopia look good. It makes utopia look like it's something which could liberate people. What happens then is the Stalin era. And here utopia begins to look really bad, and people who dislike utopia, who think utopia is dangerous, will focus on the period we're now going into. So positive assessments of utopia tend to focus on the period I've just described, very briefly in just a few minutes. Communes, name changes, the street changes, living a different way of life, emancipation of women, many different things which people see as liberating, and then the Stalin era period. However, what happens in the Stalin era period is not just 5 or 6 communes or 100 communes or just a few name changes or a few statues, but the entire country. The entire country begins to live the revolution, to live something that they call socialism. So, for example, instead of the reenactment reds and whites on a stage, now the reenactment of the October Revolution is the building of factories and the counting of how much steel is produced or how many cars are produced or how many chemicals are produced. Eventually, after the World War II victory over Hitler, the reenactment is about the army and the military and the tanks and soon the SS-20s, which you know from the parades across Red Square. And the reenactments of October, the celebration of October, become a military-based event rather than this original reds and whites on the stage. And then there's this intermediate period, which you don't remember probably, which when it was about factories, it was sort of about Fordism and Henry Ford. Steel, cars, and the chemicals, that is to say heavy industry. The thing about that is that that enveloped the whole country. So instead of just a couple of communes, that was about 1,500 new towns that were built in the Stalin era. Factory towns. Towns like Gary, Indiana, towns like Youngstown, Ohio, right? Where people imagine, in a kind of cult of the machine, people imagine that somehow industrialization would bring happiness, abundance, it would bring a total transformation of life. We look back on 1920s or 30s Gary, Indiana, or 1940s, 50s Pittsburgh, and we may see a dirty city. We may see the kind of city that would not seem a utopia to us. But from the point of view of the time period, from the point of view of the 1930s and 40s Stalin era, this was seen as the sort of advanced guard or the modernity as it was being built by the people. And so you have all sorts of ways in which, as the Stalinist regime comes in, and as the politics gets tighter and the censorship gets tighter and more people are afraid about things to say, and as the state capacity of the dictatorship increases, the utopianism spreads and becomes a mass and everyday life phenomenon. It seems paradoxical. So, for example, they're going to build socialism, which means build a factory, but is the family compatible with socialism? You see, because if the family is a bourgeois institution, and we're going to build and live socialism, we can't have the family. If the family's bourgeois, we have to have something else. So let's raise our kids together. Let's somehow create nurseries or systems in which we're not going to have these little family units in these private apartments with their little kitchens raising their kids. Instead, we're going to have people living in individual rooms, collective areas where they're going to cook, and collective areas where the children are going to play, and the children are going to be raised by professionals. So there's a period in which the family is seen as incompatible with socialism in this utopia, and they build thousands and thousands and thousands of apartment buildings without family apartments. They build them with communal apartments. That is to say, they build them on purpose in such a way that they're not self-contained units with kitchens and toilets for family use. These apartments, this is a huge legacy. It's a colossal building program across the Soviet Union. It happens during the Stalin era, and it's about the family being incompatible with socialism. Living socialism means transcending the family. Now, they changed their mind on the family. Around 1935-36, they decided that, you know what? The family predates capitalism, so it's not a bourgeois institution, and it's compatible with socialism, and moreover, it's very useful for enforcing hierarchy. It's very, very useful for enforcing hierarchy, inculcating values, bringing discipline, and having functional rather than dysfunctional people when they grow up from childhood into adulthood. And so they issue decrees, and they start to change the apartment buildings. The entire architecture profession is now organized towards building family self-contained units, family apartment buildings. Moreover, those people who are living in the communal apartments, built expressly anti-family, are living like families. They don't use the communal kitchen. They buy a little hot plate, and they make the kitchen inside their apartment. Even before the regime has admitted that the family is compatible with socialism. So you can imagine, when you're talking about, 150 million people or so, and when you're building thousands and thousands and thousands of apartment buildings, that this is a sort of scale of utopia in the 30s and 40s, much bigger than the 1920s few communes that we were mentioning as an example of living the revolution. Okay, there are lots of other things that they do during this time period. For example, jazz culture. Is jazz a bourgeois form? Is jazz bourgeois? If it's bourgeois, if it's capitalist, then if you want to be a real socialist and live a proper socialist life, you can't have jazz. And they decide, yes, it's decadent, it's bourgeois jazz. But there's a problem with jazz too. Jazz is very popular with the elite, especially on New Year's Eve during the Masquerade Ball. So there's a huge underground culture of jazz bands that are not allowed to play for the public, people like ourselves, but are kept for elite purposes. And so jazz culture, it's hard to know what exactly is capitalist culture, what predates capitalism. It's hard to know the family issue, but on some issues, it's not hard to know. Democracy, parliaments, those are bourgeois. We're not going to have those. We're not going to have that fake bourgeois democracy, that fake parliamentary system, because that exists solely for the benefit of the upper classes. It's not a real democracy. It's not universal like it professes. Instead, we're going to have Soviet power, or people's power, which is about not representative democracy, but radical democracy, or direct democracy, like the Jacobin clubs in the French Revolution. Now, it just so happens that there's a bureaucratization, and the party controls things behind the scenes, etc., but they continue with Soviets, with radical grassroots political organizations for just about the entire life of the revolution, and in fact they outlast the Soviet regime, which gets its title from these Soviets, or grassroots Jacobin clubs, radical direct democracy. Direct democracy is everyone in this room participates in the decision. Elective democracy is we decide, for example, that Louise or Sybil is in charge, and we elect them to represent us, and they go off, like, for example, to a Congress or a Parliament or a House of Representatives. Right? So this radical democracy, this direct democracy, the Soviet model. Moreover, in the economy, they decided there's going to be no private property, because that's bourgeois. There's going to be no private ownership of the means of production. There's going to be no capitalists hiring other people in wage labor. Instead, they're going to have communal property, which turns out to be state property. So every single person in the Soviet Union is a civil servant. Every single person in the Soviet Union is a state employee. They don't have any private property. No private property that's legal, except at the level of your coat, your hat. They make some concessions for a couple of pigs or a couple of cows. But for the most part, they do not have private property in the Soviet Union. Because private property is bourgeois, it's capitalist, and they have to do without it. So explain to me how you're going to run an entire economy over 150 million people, which becomes 300 million people before it's all over, without private property. Without, for example, markets, without firms deciding on consumer demand. And the way they do it is they have this so-called planned economy. The planned economy is going to be better than the market economy because the market economy does things like give you Great Depressions. The market economy does things like business cycles or throw people out of work, unemployment. We're not going to have that. We're going to be better. We're going to be scientific. We're going to have planning. We're going to be morally superior. We're not going to have wage labor. And the Soviet Union is that across this gigantic space. And so, how many pairs of shoes should be blue, or brown, or black, or red, or yellow? How many pairs of shoes should be size 7 or size 9 or size 12? Now, what would normally happen is people would buy the shoes and they would be made depending on the size of the demand for it. Normally, this is how the economists imagine the U.S. But in the Soviet case, it was people like us sitting behind a desk who decided this year we'll make 40 million pairs of red shoes and we'll make 40 million pairs of brown and 10 million pairs of black. And we'll make this many of size 5, and this many of size 7, and this many of size 9. And this seems like a stupid idea, but if you're living in the Great Depression, if you see the mass unemployment, if you see the gigantic drop in GDP, if you see how long the Depression lasts, if you see the Soviet Union building thousands of new factories, employing the entire population, planning doesn't look so foolish. It looks like the wave of the future. It looks like a better idea than the capitalist system. In fact, it doesn't even look utopian so much as it just looks like the smart thing to do. But they carry out this experiment in economics. No private property, no wage labor, no private ownership. That goes for everything, absolutely everything in the economy. They carry this thing out also for a really long time, over several generations. And there are other instances I can give you to show you just how magnified this utopia becomes. It's hard for us to get into the sense of the time period and to think that building a factory in a frozen wasteland at 40 degrees below zero with very little food could inspire hundreds of thousands, in fact millions of people to work 16-hour days and to work 7 days a week and to sacrifice as they did. But the most remarkable thing about the Soviet Union, on one side, is that millions and millions of people freely and enthusiastically participated in the building of this socialism and the living of this socialism, especially during the Great Depression. Moreover, now that we have the inside documents from the regime, the declassification, the secret archives have opened up. Now that we've seen what they seem to have told each other behind the scenes, lo and behold, they seem to have believed this stuff too. That is to say, all the people we recognize as cynics, as careerists, as Stalinists, as they couldn't possibly believe this stuff, they knew too much. It turns out they were equally caught up in this way of thinking, that the capitalist world was dying, that the capitalist world was the old way of being, and that the socialist world was a better idea, and that no matter what the problems, they were building a better world, and no matter how badly it was done, and no matter how much was a disappointment, no matter how many sacrifices were made, etc. So I could go on and I could describe this, but what happened? A couple of things happened. You have this period, 1917, 1920, the Dreamer in the Kremlin, the reenactment of the Winter Palace storming, the living the communes, the changing the names, the pulling down the statues, the erecting the new statues. In fact, science fiction in the Soviet Union explodes in the 1920s and 30s. Hundreds of works every year of original science fiction are written. There's no other country in the world up to this time that has this level outpouring of science fiction writing, for example. And they're not dystopias for the most part, they're utopias, the science fiction writing in the Soviet Union. They also translate Thomas More into Russian in this time period. And Campanella gets translated into this time period. And Fourier gets translated into Russian in this time period. So there's this colossal utopia, which during the Depression era becomes a building of a new world through factories and through this first anti-family and then compatible with the family, first anti-jazz and then jazz somehow can work, but never private property in the market and never a capitalist or bourgeois democracy. They build this whole world and it looks quite interesting, and many people in fact think it might be the way to the future, including some of your best and most interesting intellectuals. Something weird happens to the Soviet utopia, however. It gets old. It gets a little bit infirm. And those people who built socialism with their bare hands and lived in those communal apartments in the 1930s and who built those new factories and who lived in such a way that they were trying to recreate a better world, They become 60 and 70 years of age, and they ride around in limousines rather than building factories in 40 degrees below zero at some construction site out of enthusiasm. And they, behind the scenes, have access to clothing made in Paris, which people, the rest of the population doesn't know about. The revolution enters into a different phase internally. It gets a little bit older. The utopian moment is lost. People who are young and are born after World War II, they don't want to go build a factory in some frozen wasteland. They want to go to college. They want to get an education. They want to be a mathematician, or they want to be a professor of history, or whatever it is that they might want to do. They don't want to work in a factory, and they don't want to build a factory and then work in it. That's for sure, as most of their parents did. And so there's a kind of process underway internally, in this internally generated utopia. It's hard to recreate the atmosphere of this 30s and 40s stuff, but it really is. There's a lot of arrests, there's a lot of deportation, there's a lot of terror, there's a huge amount of coercion. Nonetheless, knowing about the coercion, knowing about the arrests, knowing about the terror, there's still a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. The terror and the enthusiasm coexist. It's hard to recreate that atmosphere. It's much easier for us to understand the post-World War II atmosphere, where it kind of gets a little bit older and a little bit cynical, and a little bit the youth don't want to do it because they have other concerns. But the change that's even bigger, and we'll stop here, we'll take questions in a few minutes, is not only inside the country, but it's outside the country. That's the really, really big change. The world shifts. So, the capitalist world is not in depression anymore. It has, in the 50s and 60s, the biggest economic and consumer boom in the history of the world. In Japan and Germany, and also in most of Western Europe and the United States, the capitalist world has a consumer revolution. Not just high GDP, not just incredible economic growth, but the creation of a middle class, a huge middle class, such that people, for example, like my father, who worked in an embroidery factory, bought a house. We didn't live in Levittown, but it's the same kind of story. This huge consumerist boom is also a utopia. It's a different kind of utopia. Maybe you'll get a lecture on that. I don't know. But that huge change, right, in the capitalist world, if capitalism is not about mass unemployment, if capitalism is not about imperialist slaughter like World War I, if capitalism is not about dictatorship like in Hitler's Germany, or Mussolini's Italy, or Franco's Spain, or Antonescu's Romania, or Pilsudski's Poland, or Hirohito's Japan, and I could go on. Dictatorship is the primary mode, not democracy, of political organization in the advanced countries in the 30s, with a few exceptions, for example, like France, which almost goes that way, and does in Vichy. Britain, which doesn't really totter the United States, but for the most part, capitalism is dictatorship in the 30s, but not after World War II. The dictatorships have been crushed. They've been defeated. And democracy, parliament, become very widespread. Consumer revolution and democracy, rather than depression, unemployment, and dictatorship. Imperialist war? Well, not really, because there's decolonization. And the capitalists are forced to give up their direct rule for occupied colonies. There's decolonization. And the more you look at the world, it's the capitalist world that's undergone this total transformation. Now, I remind you, this happened in large part because Hitler's army is defeated on the Eastern Front by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has destroyed the Nazi war machine, which is, you probably know the details, but just in June 1941, 3.5 million troops invaded the Soviet Union. In June 1941, 3.5 million troops invaded the Soviet Union, right? There were 220 divisions active on the Eastern Front. How many divisions in North Africa with all the Patton and the Rommel and everything else? Perhaps 11, perhaps 13 divisions, depends how you count divisions, compared to 220 on the Eastern Front. How many German divisions when the landing at Normandy took place in the West? 30, 35, depending on you count. 220 in the East. If there's no Eastern Front, you couldn't get up near that Normandy beach as long as many tries as you would have had. because there would have been 200-something divisions going to the west. In any case, the Nazi war machine is defeated on the Eastern Front. The Japanese war machine is defeated by the United States in the Pacific. It's not quite the same, but it's more analogous. The Western Front in World War II is not analogous to the Eastern Front, but the Japanese, the Pacific War is closer, although still the Soviet scheme is bigger. The Japanese lost 3 million soldiers in World War II. The Soviet Union lost 27 million, including civilians, and they won. But in any case, so the Soviet Union knocks the guts out of the Nazis, which leads to a total transformation in the capitalist world and the kind of imposition or adoption, depending on your point of view, of the U.S. model. Consumerism, democracy, decolonization, or no formal colonies. Instead, it's called the world economy, or informal empire. And so this new capitalist world that comes out of World War II has shifted the whole game. And the Soviet Union doesn't look the same. Because if capitalism is not that dictatorship like Hitler, but it's instead all sorts of people participating in politics, then the Soviet system doesn't quite look as interesting or as utopian or as cutting edge anymore. And if life is about vacuum cleaners and automobiles and supermarkets and winter coats, then capitalism doesn't look the same anymore as it did when it was a depression. But importantly, the Soviet Union doesn't look the same anymore. Right? When they show Tutsi in Moscow, Dustin Hoffman is walking through this apartment. He goes into this room, and then he goes into this room, then he goes into this room, and then he goes into this room. And the Soviet audience is watching him, and he's walking, and they're counting 13 rooms, 14 rooms, 15 rooms. My God, do they live like that over there? They don't know, but they suspect it could be the case. And then he goes out on the street, and you're looking at Dustin Hoffman, and they're looking at the supermarket that he's walking by, which they had. So capitalism changes, and the image of capitalism changes as well inside the Soviet Union. And so it's not just the Soviet Union got older, cynical, decrepit, and all the other things that we know about it. It's that the outside world shifted, and a kind of capitalist utopia, of course, World War II, triumphed and was successful. And so socialism, which was the transcendence of capitalism, the better version of modernity, better both morally and also on capitalism's own terms, in terms of abundance and freedom, turns out not to look better. It turns out to look less utopian by the 1970s and 80s than it did earlier. Now, in the 1970s and 80s, not everybody knows about the capitalist transformation, but there's a lot of suspicion that it might have happened. And then what happens is they lift censorship under glasnost, and then everybody knows. Everybody knows that our free healthcare in the Soviet Union is not so great compared to the free healthcare in West Germany or in Sweden. So this huge shift in the outside world changes the Soviet utopia. Now, just to summarize where I come down on this utopia question, and then if there are any questions from the audience. We've gone pretty long. We're about, 30, 40 minutes into the lecture. Okay. It's at this point that I tell off-color jokes with the undergraduates. Are we allowed off-color jokes here? Probably not. Are we allowed off-color jokes? How many roll-ups does it take to screw in a light bulb? None. They don't screw light bulbs. They screw each other, and then they go on television and talk about it. That's America, right? Excuse me for that. Beg your pardon. I'm supposed to be one of those Princeton professors whose Augustine doesn't get it. As I revealed to you where I come from. I'm a climber. I'm an RV. This is not where I was born. I still can't get used to it. Stars? Okay. So, now that I had your attention again, that terrible joke, after all that nonsense about utopia that I tried to convey, obviously it was rather compressed. There may be questions about that or about other things. But so what happens is the Soviet Union becomes this completely schizophrenic utopia. People look back, and those who think utopia is a good thing or a hopeful thing those who think utopia is meaningful for us, that we should be utopian, that we should have dreams, that we should feel that anything is possible. They don't want to talk about Stalinism. They don't want to talk about these communal apartment buildings and these gigantic factories and this cult of the machine and this worship of steel. And they don't want to talk about things like the absence of private property on a mass scale across 11 time zones and 6 to the earth. They want to talk about instead, right, the anarchists and the hippies in the 1920s living on the outskirts of town while the regime is small, while the regime doesn't have much state capacity, while censorship is weak, while there's a dictatorship but it doesn't have the power to enforce itself throughout the social and political space. They want to talk instead about the opening up of the system, the revolutionary possibility, the sense that anything can happen, that we can remake the world, that we can remake this Russian Empire into something more just and a better system. Better certainly than it was under the czars, and better than it is outside the country in the advanced places like Britain or the US. Those people who have a negative view of utopia, however, they love the Stalin theory. They love it as a parable. They think, you see, utopia is dangerous. You see, if you let these utopians get into power, if you let these dreamers get into power, the next thing you know, we'll all be stuck with hot plates in our apartment buildings, and we won't have kitchens in our apartment buildings, or we won't have any private property, and we won't have a market, and we won't have abundance. Instead, we'll have, 1.5 socks for 330 people, or whatever the exact number is. In any case, so this schizophrenic Soviet utopia, it's either really bad or it's either really great. This runs through all the accounts of the Soviet Union. There's another version of it. There's another version, which is that it's not utopia at all. It's just cynical, it's just political dictatorship, etc., etc. This, of course, doesn't explain the life experience of these millions of people who have left memoirs, many of whom are still alive, many of whom I met, and who in the public record and even in the secret documents have now revealed there to be this sort of incredible outpouring of feeling and emotion. So there is a view which denies utopia completely, but more interesting for me is the schizophrenic version of utopia, whereby it's either really bad or really good, and you find one period to your liking versus another period. I recommend Richard Stites on Revolutionary Dreams, a Georgetown professor, for the early period of utopia, which is quite an excellent book, Richard Stites, a Georgetown professor. And I would recommend the Princeton professor for the second period of utopia, the Stalin period of utopia, but that would be tooting my own horn. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. Rusty, but somehow I managed. Are there questions? Disputes? Yes.
I was surprised at the your description of the limited influence after the end of the Civil War in the 20s. What were the Soviets weren't in control then of the whole country?
So the question is the extent of Soviet or communist power in the 1920s. And so this is a great question. What do we know about this question? We know that they planted the red flag in all the town squares. We know that they had a police force. We know that they had secret informants and denunciations. We also know that in many places the Tsarist double-headed eagle didn't get taken down until 1932 or 1937 or 1944 or 1945, depending on the place and locality. We also know that people made anti-communist speeches right in front of these red flags and weren't arrested in the 1920s. So there's a way in which the communist regime's aspirations were complete in this time period, but its capacity to enforce its will over the whole space was not yet complete. And so there's if you looked at the decrees, the communist decrees from the 1920s, it looks like they were very powerful. They issued a huge number of decrees saying, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. But why do they have to issue 75 decrees on the exact same subject. Evidently, the first 74 were not being enforced or lived by. And so the screaming, the kind of public presentation of our power may indicate an inability to enforce their will completely. That's not to say that there were alternatives to the communist regime. There were no alternatives to the communist regime in an organized public fashion. Those had been destroyed, and they were very good at destruction of other political parties or other movements. But that didn't translate into the ability to enact their visions across the whole country. This came with the building of factories, with the industrialization, which incorporated millions of people into the communist dream and living socialism, and with the collectivization of agriculture, which was even bigger because the country was 2/3 peasant and 1/3 urban in the 1930s. And in fact, the Gulag system or the labor camp system and the police system all grew exponentially from the 20s to the 30s, even though it's all in place already in the 20s and comes already from World War I, even before the Bolsheviks come to power. So the issue is, how much daily enforcement of their power do they have for their program? Not how much could they suppress. They were quite successful with that. So, I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's my view. Somebody in the back had a hand? Yes.
Now, what are the effect on the arts in Soviet Union and their utopia? I think of America in the 60s, there was a passion of music and film and
Yes.
artistic design.
Yes, I think that's another excellent question. How do you fit the arts into this picture? Well, you have Hal Foster on your schedule. I believe he's the concluding lecture in the Utopia series. Hal Foster is our professor of modernism here on the Princeton campus, and given that I saw he was on the schedule, I decided to leave the arts out. However, I'll say a few things in response to your question, although I think Professor Foster will handle it a lot better. I teach a course called Avant-Garde and Dictatorship in the European Cultural Studies, ECS program here on the campus. So what's fascinating about the avant-garde and utopia stuff in the arts is that it predates 1917. It's quite an efflorescence already before the political revolution. Many people take this as evidence that the revolution was genuine. You see, it's already bubbling up. It's already pervasive in the society. And so it's not some Bolshevik coup or Bolshevik plot. It's wider and broader than the Bolsheviks. Look at all of the painting and the design and the architecture and the song. Some of it is in the Russian Empire, some of it's outside the Russian Empire, like Diaghilev, for example, in Paris. But there's a tremendous flowering of the culture and of new methods in theater, as well as ballet, and new forms of architecture or design. And a lot of this continues after 1917. Many of the artists regard the political revolution as consonant with their cultural revolution or with their creative revolution. And they want to serve in some public way the political revolution. Some of the artists reject the political revolution as a dictatorship or as vulgar or whatever. And then there's the usual story is Stalin destroys the avant-garde and they disappear from history. But in fact, it's more complicated than that. A lot of it gets incorporated into Soviet design and Soviet propaganda. And many of the avant-garde people who are less famous take important roles in the Soviet Union under Stalin. And there's a revival, for example, of artistic modernism and architecture under Khrushchev in the 50s and 60s. So it's a very complicated question. I've given a very superficial thumbnail sketch to it. I'll say that the literature, just like there's the schizophrenia on the whole utopia question in the Soviet Union, there's a little bit on the artistic one. Those who like modernism tend to separate it as much as possible from the political regime. And those who dislike modernism tend to equate it as much as possible with those Bolsheviks, those communists, those Reds. And of course, the picture in reality is some can be equated and some refuse to be equated, etc. The bigger story than artistic modernism in some ways is mass culture. The advent of radio, the advent of cinema, later it will be television instead of just radio, mass newspapers, photographs in newspapers, new type for newspapers, etc. There's a revolution in media and in the reach of mass media, so that 95% of all the publications in the Russian Empire are circulated within Moscow and St. Petersburg. But by the end of the 1930s, there are millions and millions of radios across the time zone, and there's also circulation of newspapers to remote villages, etc. And there's greater literacy in those places as well. So there's a revolution in mass culture, a mass cultural revolution, which has implications for the elite, because if the avant-garde is in charge of culture, they decide what's good taste and what's bad taste. If the masses are in charge of culture, if the mass tastes are in charge, the avant-garde needs some type of subsidies or whatever. This is the story of the kind of NEH version of the Soviet Union. How they shielded people who did experimental stuff from the mass market, from the Philistine tastes of the masses, by subsidizing theater or subsidizing publishing. You knew this was the case because when the Soviet Union ended, all those subsidies ended, and all those artists and writers, instead of publishing novels with 1 million press runs, published novels with press runs of 75. And so the mass culture story is a really important one. It connects in many ways to the artistic modernism story. But I think Foster is going to do quite a detailed lecture on that stuff. So I'll leave it at that if that's okay. Yeah, over here.
My question is about all the other republics that formed in the Soviet Union, the other 20-some republics. Did they buy into this plan of the Soviet communist ideal that you set up as a utopia? Or were they really struggling with all of their ethnic and religious identities all these years?
That's a great question. I left that out. It's a very complicated story, and I gave it such a compressed, simplified version to begin with. The shortest possible answer is that there are no republics in the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire is made up of provinces. Finland, yes. And Bukhara and Khiva in Central Asia, yes. But otherwise, there are only provinces. No Belarus, no Ukraine, no Kazakhstan, no Uzbekistan. These do not exist in the Russian Empire. There's the Western province and the Southern province, and something called Turkestan province, which is rather large. In fact, all those things, with a few exceptions, like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which are independent in between World War I and World War II. With a few exceptions, all of those republics are created by the Soviet Union. And that's part of the utopian story too. Because they believe that the British Empire is evil. It's the bourgeois version of empire. It's imperialism in a bad way. And they're going to do it, the Soviets are, in a better way. They're going to give people their own nation, not rule them and steal their resources and don't make them into literate, productive citizens like the British and the French do in Africa or the Dutch in Indonesia. Instead, they're going to create a country with a language that is taught in schools and known across all the different dialects, the way Hamburg dialect was picked for German in the 1870s, and Florentine Italian was picked for Italy in the 1860s, and the Seine dialect around Paris was picked for France around the same time period. They'll pick one provincial dialect and make it the national language of this new republic. They'll give it borders, they give it an Academy of Science, so that it has research and an identity about its past and its folklore. They build industry there, whatever it might be, so they have employment. There's affirmative action, Soviet style, in employment in the bureaucracy, locally as well as in the capital. And so they create an empire of nations. Not an empire of just rapaciously exploited colonial territories, but in the Soviet mentality, an empire where you've given them some type of wherewithal to have their Uzbek state identity, their Ukrainian identity, but also a Soviet identity. It's Soviet Ukraine. It's Soviet Uzbekistan. It's not nationalism solely. It's nationalism for the purpose of building socialism and building this larger Soviet empire of nations, or friendship of peoples is another phrase that they use. So this is quite deliberate and quite socially engineered, and just like the building of factories or the collectivization of agriculture as a whole, there's a version of all of this in the various different so-called republics. Now, the republics will tell you differently. They'll tell you that the Soviet Union is an occupier, that they didn't really build, that instead they took and they stole and they raped, just like the British or the French in their colonies. There's an anti-colonial story that comes out of these places that is a counter-narrative to the Soviet version of all of this. If you go to Brighton Beach, and you go to Tashkent, and you go to Vladivostok, you can see tremendous similarities in the culture. There is a large identity known as Soviet people and Soviet culture. And we think Brighton Beach is Russian or it's Jewish, but in fact it's Soviet. And the same music that they play in Brighton Beach from 1977 or 1981 can be heard or seen on Tashkent television and in television in Vladivostok. So even with the anti-colonial story, there is some type of Soviet identity that transcends the nationalisms. They're not just Uzbeks, they're Soviet Uzbeks, and they share a culture. They share an imperial culture, known as the Soviet culture. So there's a lot more to that story. There's the story of the repression and deportations, and there's the story of arrests and beheading the intelligentsias of these peoples. But every time they do mass arrests in the Ukraine, and they kill off Ukrainian leaders, the state keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they need more and more people who are Ukrainian to fill these bureaucratic positions. So the purges don't lead to the end of this process. They lead to the end of the lives of many people. And it's quite tragic, it's quite bloody. But the process continues to expand. And that's why today you have something called Ukraine, but some people think it's Soviet domination, so there is this anti-colonial. Yeah, okay.
You explained to us how the post-World War II change in the West,
Right.
with the abundance and plenty, raises questions for the dreamers of the utopia of socialism of the Soviet Union. Bring that now to more current times where they've attempted to transform more like the West, and we hear life is almost less good for them today than it was earlier. What's the implication then for people looking at where they go from this point? Back or continuing to try to emulate the West?
Yes, one of the European empires. If you got up and spoke positively about empire, you'd be in trouble. People would sort of shout you down. Once we've lived through post-empire, and we've seen these kleptocratic states, and we've seen these Mobutos, and we've seen Suharto in Indonesia. Now, a lot of this is supported during the Cold War by U.S. interests, and it's a complicated story why it happens. Whatever the reason why, it's a fact that disillusionment sets in. Post-Soviet disillusionment is also quite deep. So now empire as a subject in historical studies is all of a sudden positive again. It's not just that interwar nostalgia for the Habsburgs or for the Ottomans, but empire, turns out, if you read history today, it's not about domination. It's about exchange. It's a conversation between peoples. Empire is not about me coming in and stealing your land or forcing you to work as a slave laborer. Empire is about how I influenced you and you influenced me, and we were both changed in the process. There's a less pejorative view of empire now generally than there was in the 50s and 60s during the original decolonization, in large part because of this disillusionment with the post-imperial realities, what I call trash canistans. However, where do these trash canistans come from? You know, the Soviet Union created Uzbekistan, in other words. The sort of, you're disillusioned with Uzbekistan, and you want the Soviet Union back. Well, guess what? The reason you're disillusioned with this Uzbekistan is because it comes out of the Soviet Union. And so there's a way in which the nostalgia is a little bit misplaced. There's some nostalgia, for example, for the 1970s. This is a little bit more understandable because in the 1973 there was the oil shock. And the Arab-Israeli war, and the Saudis and others decided to what was then the pre-OPEC. OPEC decided to cut off oil to Western suppliers. The price of oil went up 400%. Price of oil went up 400% in 6 months, a little bit less, 1973. The Soviet Union had discovered Siberian oil in the 60s. So all Soviet exports were now bringing 4 times as much money as they were before. Moreover, the Soviet Union was exporting military equipment, and guess who was buying it? All the Arab kingdoms were stocking up on Soviet weaponry. So the Soviets were making big dough off of 400% increase in the price of oil. The Soviets are the second biggest oil country in the world after Saudi Arabia. Russia is now in that position. From the oil and from selling the weaponry. So there was a lot of cash, there was a lot of dough in the 70s. That's one of the reasons the Brezhnev elite didn't feel like they had to change very much. Crisis, alcoholism, the West is gaining on us, low productivity. Well, the U.S. is in Vietnam and loses the Vietnam War. The oil crisis sends the U.S. into depression. Japan, for the first time in post-World War II, has a decline in GDP of 6% between 73 and 75. So the Brezhnev people are dancing the hopa in the Kremlin because they have all this cash. What they do with the cash, however, is to spend it on themselves. Luxury cars, imported pornography. Now, in the stores, there's more sausage for the working class. So if it does filter down, there is a kind of trickle down. We didn't invent that, but the communists were quite good at that too. There is a kind of trickle down effect. And some people have nostalgia because there was a lot of sausage in the stores in the 70s as a result of this oil shock. And then this, unfortunately, things didn't work out. And in fact, in '85, the Saudis, to teach the Soviets a lesson, massively increased oil production, and the price of oil dropped to its lowest level yet in post-World War II period. And Gorbachev had been in power for a couple of months, and he was completely broke. And his perestroika was tanking already because the Saudis were teaching him a lesson about who was king of the mountain in the oil market. So the oil story is quite important and quite complicated. There is this little 1970s nostalgia for the extra sausages. The elite had much more extra. The ordinary people had some extra. However, if you actually look at the facts of how many people had apartments and how many were on 15-year waiting lists for apartments, how many people had automobiles and how many didn't have automobiles, you can see that the nostalgia is often misplaced and rosier than the life really was. The situation now where the place is going, I guess we're at the time period where we've run out. Anyway, the situation now, it varies tremendously. If you were on a pension, you worked your whole life under the Soviet system, and you're on a pension, and they changed the whole system, and your pension is worth a nickel, you're pretty unhappy. If, however, you're young, and you have a little bit of energy, and a little bit of get up and go, and a little bit of entrepreneurialism, you might not be so unhappy with the new situation. You can travel the world. You have access to all sorts of foreign languages and media. You have, in addition, the possibility to open up a business. Start your own business. You have the option of failing at your business, but you have the option of trying. So it varies tremendously depending on who you are. There are great inequities. People in positions of power in the old regime stole everything that was there. That's one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed. It was like a massive bank run on itself. And so people, insiders, who had caused that horrible thing called the Soviet Union, are in some ways the biggest beneficiaries of the Soviet collapse. Because in fact, they brought it about. You know, that's a tremendous inequity, and people feel social injustice that happened. So that colors also the nostalgia, etc. The picture is varied depending on where you are. If you look at the whole post-communist space, from Central Europe all the way through to Mongolia, Poland, more or less a success, although hard to say where it's going. It looked good in the early 90s, looks less good now. But with the exception of Poland, countries are small. Estonia,
tremendous relative success. Poorest country in Europe in some ways, but relative to the other post-Soviet countries, really in pretty good shape. Estonia is the great winner of all this in some ways, and maybe Slovenia is the other great winner of this. Czech Republic, a little bit like Poland, in between, hard to know. Slovakia, a little bit like the in-between, hard to know, etc. Maybe Slovakia is a success, maybe Hungary is a success, maybe Poland is a success, certainly Slovenia, and certainly Estonia. But guess what? The biggest success of all is the city of Moscow. The growth, the economic growth, the purchasing power, the standard of living in Moscow, the concentration of wealth and the concentration of brain power in Moscow is enormous. Guess what? Moscow is bigger than Estonia by a factor of 6. It's bigger than Slovenia by almost the same amount. It's bigger than Hungary. It's bigger than the Czech Republic. Moscow is bigger than Slovakia. Moscow is bigger than everything except Poland. And it's a lot better off than Poland. It's a lot richer than Poland. And it's a lot more Western than Poland, if you've been to the two places as I have. Poland has a lot of issues now about things. Identity and the role of the church and other things. So now Moscow is not the entire Russia. It's just one city of it. But it's about 10% of the economy, and now in concentric circles, the closer you are to Moscow, the better you're doing. And so the circle is widening, in fact. And so this big pocket, this big engine of Moscow is growing very fast and is doing quite big things. Is the system like ours? Is it, no. It'll never be West Germany. It'll always be Russia. And so we can't judge it by the standards of Princeton, New Jersey, or Marin County, California, or some nice West German provincial city. You have to judge it by other standards. And by those standards, it's a huge success story, but it's quite early in the game, I have to say. China is an interesting comparison in some ways. People think China came out better. China doesn't have a stable transition political system. It has a mysterious process. We don't quite know how new leaders are picked. It's not transparent. China has enormous corruption. It doesn't really have a judiciary. The China system and the Russian system are not as different as the press makes them out to be. I don't know where China is going either. None of us know the future. But the Russian story is quite early in that story. And a lot will depend on their ability to remake their institutions, to remake their regulatory mechanisms, their judiciaries, to remake the institutions that make capitalism work. And so they had, when Boris Yeltsin woke up on January 1st, 1992, he had 6,000 judges. That's how many inherited from the Soviet Union. Something comparable in proportion is inherited by all the other leaders of both Soviet states. Now they have about 18,000 judges. So they've tripled the number of judges. It's a huge accomplishment to triple the number of judges in just 12 years. Boris Yeltsin woke up on January 1st, 1992, and inherited 6,000 judges. He also inherited 250,000 KGB operatives. And we expected rule of law somehow to come from that. Well, now he's got 18,000 judges. We don't know how many KGB operatives. It's secret. It was public for a while, and it's become secret now again under Putin. We suspect the number is no smaller than the 200,000 or 250,000 or so that were there then. So your expectations should be in line with those inherited realities, those institutions that made up the Soviet Union that now make up the stuff of the post-Soviet Union. Poland is a little bit different in that they had an opposition to communism, a full-fledged opposition, an underground university system, the church and the sermons and the priesthood, an alternative view of history, an alternative view of professionalism already in the communist period. Hungary had a private sector in urban areas, way before 1989, way before the collapse of communism. So these things matter hugely for the post-Soviet inheritance. So depending on your standards, you could be quite optimistic about the Russian thing, or you could be disappointed if you had much higher expectations for where it's going to go. But the nostalgia, I hope I explained, is quite understandable, although it's a little bit misplaced, but not completely misplaced. Yeah. Sorry if I give long answers, but I have all these things running through my head, and you're captive.
Do you want to take just one or two more? One more question. One more
Well,
question.
you guys are in charge, so. It's your utopias.
How did the artificial Ukrainian famine play into the utopian scheme?
Well, we now have the secret documents on the Ukrainian famine. And I'm not sure I would use the word artificial. Famines are about the failure to distribute food, for the most part. I won't go into the arguments, but Amartya Sen, who's won a Nobel Prize, has argued that democracies don't suffer famines, dictatorships suffer famines. Because dictatorships are not responsive, and they're not flexible, and they're not the kind of mechanisms politically to respond to these crises. Whether he's right or wrong, that's a principal argument. The Soviet Union did not create a famine in Ukraine. What it did was lie about the famine in Ukraine. It denied that there was a famine in Ukraine. But there was a famine in Ukraine, in part because of the failure of the authorities to respond to issues with the harvest and with the distribution of food. And so the famine is not solely in the Ukraine. It's in the North Caucasus, it's in the Kuban, and the 32-33 famine to which you're referring to, I guess, is not the only famine. There are quite a number of famines in the Soviet Union. There are a couple in the 20s, there are several, there's one during the war, there's a huge post-World War II famine in 46-47. That's pretty much, late 40s is the end of the famines, and the system gets much better at dealing with food distribution. So, the lying, the censorship, the refusal to acknowledge reality, the use of terror, etc., are all things I don't think we can say too many positive things about. What's interesting, however, is that many people were willing to deny the famine, knowing the famine existed, because they believed in the utopia of building a new society, and they were ready to say it's more important to support the building of utopia than it is to admit that we have a famine. And so Lev Kobolev, for example, Lev Kobolev, who's the greatest scholar of German literature in the Soviet Union. We don't know him because, unlike Solzhenitsyn, he emigrated, he was kicked out. He emigrated to Germany, not to Vermont. Lev Kobolev wrote, I think, probably the best memoir ever of the Soviet Union. The Education of a True Believer is the name of the memoir. And he was one of the people who went into those Ukrainian villages where he had been born, and he took the grain in Stalin's collectivization and dekulakization campaigns, and he saw the people who were starving. And he reflects, with the fullness of time, back on how it was, as a youth, he could see these skeletons, he could see these children, he could see these malnourished people dying, and yet he was still taking their grain to deliver to the cities where the workers lived, to deliver to the army, or to deliver to the state coffers, etc. Where, by the way, it rotted. It never made it to the cities, it never made it to the army, and the distribution system was terrible, and a lot of food was lost. It wasn't just that it was taken out of the villages. So Lev Kobolev is able to explain his mentality and look at the kind of this true believer type that he was, seeing this famine. So it wasn't just Walter Duranty, who was in the news today, who got a Pulitzer Prize in the 30s and denied or did not acknowledge the existence of the Soviet famine while he was reporting out of Moscow. It was great people like Lev Kobolev who became a dissident and became one of the great advocates of human rights, who in his youth had a different view about where this was all going and what he should say about the famine. So even on things like the famine, you could know it, and you could still cling to this new world in creation. After all, you were living it. You were becoming something more than yourself. It wasn't just the country, it was you too. And yesterday you were illiterate, and yesterday you had no skill, no occupation, no job, and today you were in a literacy program, and you were going to night school, and tomorrow you were deputy minister for agriculture. and you were 33, or you were 36 years old, or whatever. Or you were party secretary in Kazakhstan, or you were party secretary in Dnipropetrovsk, like Leonid Brezhnev, for example, or like all the people of the Brezhnev generation, Mikhail Suslov, etc. People you wouldn't know but are the equivalent of Brezhnev. So this Kokolev generation, experiencing the famine, but thinking that there was something bigger than the famine going on, unfortunately. That was part of it. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but education of a true believer by Kokolev. So are we done at this point?